Hey y'all, this is a new series I've been wanting to do for a while. It covers a variety of the more unknown, obscure type conspiracies, although there are a few that I'm sure all of you have heard of, but for the most part, I tried to find the ones that weren't covered a million times before. And in this one, a lot of them I don't deep dive on, I just kinda gloss over them because there's just not a lot of info out there. And finally, this video won't have a lot of the darker conspiracy theories, because I just don't want to get flagged on YouTube for one thing, but also, it's just not my cup of tea, but they are interesting nonetheless. We start off with one that's sorta known by people who are online a lot, but probably not well known to the casual conspiracy buff, that of the 2006 Volleyball Incident. I hesitated to make this one the first topic, since a lot of you that follow the conspiracy world will already know most of the details, but for the ones that don't know, basically, this theory speculates that in 2006, at a school or university, somewhere out in one of the western states, usually Nebraska or South Dakota, but sometimes also North Dakota, Utah, Oregon, or Montana, depending on the source, a spree shooting would occur which resulted in the deaths of around 20 people, and again, depending on which version of the story you hear, some of these were students, sometimes it was faculty. It all varies. Sometimes it said crime scene photos leaked online before they were found and erased. Others say it was worse than Columbine, while even others say that it was not a shooting, but a bombing instead. But the key point where the theory comes in is that the entire incident was completely covered up and hidden by the media and powers that be. This led to the word never getting out, as the public didn't talk about it, and the victims' families basically were told to shut up and be quiet about it. And just why would the powers that be do this? The main theories allege that it was either a psyops or, more commonly said to be, that of a training exercise for more potential spree shootings. Which brings us back around to the strange irony in all of this. If the entire incident was covered up, how come we know about it? That brings us to the first real weakness of this conspiracy. A secret covered like this would not be discussed so openly. Likewise, the shooting itself, according to its own conspiracy, would make more sense to be used in a way to change opinions about such sensitive issues like guns. So to cover it up is kinda counterintuitive, but where exactly did it come from? The earliest found mention of the conspiracy itself actually goes back to 2017 on an online forum where a poster who expressed his desire to spread a new kind of online hoax. So he basically made this theory up. Likewise, many people get it confused from a very real event where a man barged into a Colorado high school in 2006 and assaulted 7 female students before killing one, and then ultimately killing himself. This was perpetrated by a loser named Dwayne Morrison, and anyone researching the 2006 volleyball incident might be surprised to see this pop up in their Google search. This has also led to others citing the whole thing as a symptom of the Mandela effect. It should be no surprise in a conspiracy video that we would come across cryptid theories, much to the ire of some of my viewers, but the theory is called Advanced Cryptozoology, which alleges that not only are cryptids very real, but the government itself knows this fact and is deliberately covering it up. And why would they cover it up, you may ask? The theory then expands and takes a more extraterrestrial turn and alleges that Bigfoot, Mothman, Dogman, etc. are actually interdimensional beings popping in and out of our dimension, which explains why they are so difficult to actually catch, and explains why you can never find a body, as they always die in their dimension. According to the theory, the governments know this and just can't stop it, and in order to keep the public from panicking, they cover it up. Sometimes, it's even alleged that it's hushed up so the technologies associated with the cryptids can be hidden and used by various world governments. The theory also kinda rolls into another conspiracy, which alleges that cryptids are actually the byproduct of genetic or biological warfare. A prime example of this was the Goat Man sightings that happened in Clinton, Maryland in October of 1971, which details the events of citizens who would lose their beloved dogs only to find the mangled carcasses a few days later with no explanation as to what had happened. It was soon that the stories began to pop up of a creature being spotted with a human face and a body covered with hair, or sometimes just the lower half looking like that of a goat. and before long, a connection between the dead dogs and the creature was made, and people realized that Goatman was killing their beloved pets. This story would grow even more dark, with reports of Goatman beginning to kill other animals and even a few humans, before he would retreat back into the woods where he had built a makeshift shelter. Although it is classified as an urban legend, there were actually multiple reports taken by police over the sightings of this creature, but just to tie it back to the government theory, many people believe that not only was Goatman real, but it also stemmed from a failed experiment coming from the nearby Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, where it said a Dr. Stephen Fletcher was doing an experiment on goats and it backfired, and mutated the goat and himself into the Goatman, causing him to run out immediately and began attacking cars in the road before fleeing into the woods. In 1990, a largely forgotten and obscure children's film would be released that went by the name Spinosaurus. Now the film was pretty miserable and it was destined to be a flop. Or was it? We actually don't know, since all the details are lost at this point, but we do know the plot was supposed to be an attempt by unknown parties to let the public know that dinosaurs were still alive in Southeast Asia. That's right, and not only that, these dinosaurs would actually go on to help North Vietnam defeat the United States in the Vietnam War. Which brings us back to the failure of the movie, because apparently the CIA, everyone's favorite conspiracy boogeyman, would hear word about this movie being produced, and they put eyes in the studio, which revealed the plot before the film came out. The CIA, knowing they couldn't allow the information to get out that the US lost due to dinosaurs in Asia, would create a task force, or maybe it's better described as shadow group, called N.U.G.E.T, or N.U.G.E.T. And the agents for N.U.G.E.T had one goal, and that was to appear in various sectors of the media, pretending to be movie critics where they would universally pan the film, giving it the most negative, scathing reviews one could imagine, in hopes of tarnishing the film to such a point that no one would want to watch it, and in the process, it would destroy the careers of everyone who worked on the title. And while all of this sounds completely ridiculous, keep in mind, Project Mockingbird was a real CIA operation that began in the 50s to influence the American news media, so I mean, it's not like it hasn't happened before. Anyways, the plan worked and the film flopped, so bad that they didn't even bother making copies to sell at stores. The original film was then seized by N.U.G.E.T agents and put away. And it's here that author Michael Crichton would hear rumors of the film the government hid or destroyed, and it would inspire him to write Jurassic Park, or in some variations, he and the screenwriter, David Koepp, discovered the original script, The Spinosaurus, and then changed it to a story that would be approved by the government. But where does all this come from? This theory gets its origin point on 4chan, and strangely enough, it's hard to find any of the original posts, since from what I can find, it wasn't a long-running conspiracy, only popping up around the time the Jurassic Park remake started in the 2010s. Although, I was able to find that N.U.G.E.T is a bigger conspiracy theory, which stands for National Unconventional Government Experimental Technology, and they allegedly worked on mind control and the control of media, so there's that. Alternative medicine is kind of surprisingly a hot topic for many in the medical community, with some people swearing by it, claiming that Big Pharma is actively trying to hide these herbs and supplements that could possibly help you, because the conventional medicinal companies would lose money once people discovered these methods, while many on the other side doubt the so-called medicinal herbs or acupuncture or homeopathy and claim none of these things do much of anything, and chalk it up to being nothing more than old folk remedies. But what if they did work, but only after substantial research was done on an individual first? That brings us to the medicinal personalization conspiracy, which suggests that alternative medicines and procedures do actually work and make a person live a much longer and much healthier life. But the problem is, it has to be very specified to the individual, which takes all this expensive research and testing that needs to be done to an individual, testing that most people will never afford, yet the elite can, which allows them to go through with all this testing and research, and then they can be provided with the exact concoction needed for these alternative medicines to greatly improve their health and prolong their life to live on average much longer than the normal person. This causes the average person to also search for alternative medicines, a much less expensive medicines and supplements. And they end up buying something like Tangy Tangerine from Alex Jones, which of course doesn't do much, because without going through the research process, the random assortment of alternative medicines and supplements rarely do anything. Golf rumors is another one I kinda lumped together with the 2006 Volleyball Incident, in the fact that both are pretty well known to the online community, but probably not so much by the casual conspiracy community. According to the story, which there's numerous variations of, an unnamed female journalist was covering the 2009 PGA tournament when she would go, or was invited, to an after party, but upon walking to the basement where this party was being held, she would be stunned to walk in on occult activity. What this activity was, again, varies, but in all accounts, it's supposed to be very disturbing and satanic, and I probably couldn't discuss it here anyways. The frightened young lady would then leave the party immediately and went back home and wrote an article discussing the depravity she's seen and posted it to Politico, whom she worked for. As soon as the story was posted, it was immediately removed because the powers that be, whom I guess had connections with the PGA, were very upset with her for sharing this story and soon threatened her by stating she might have an unfortunate accident. The story would grow stranger though, because you know as I know, it's almost impossible to delete anything from the internet now, and some people were able to read the story, and this led to it being discussed online, and soon forums were created around the discussion of the story. This in turn caused massive amounts of posts discussing golf rumors to be removed and then scrubbed from the internet archive. After this, it's said that days later, the PGA, being shook up by the story, worked with a famous golfer, who I will not name here, to go public with his story about his very real affair, in an effort to get people to quit talking about the golf rumors. Later on, that journalist we still have no name for would die under suspicious circumstances, but it was buried in the news because of the very real public scandal of the married golfer. Crazily enough, that's only one version of what golf rumors are supposed to be. Other theories cite a man named Robert Goff, who was hired by the government and was then experimented on by the CIA in an MK Ultra type way, and he is supposed to be the source of the golf rumors. While another theory cites that the word GOF stands for Global Oscillations at Low Frequencies, and it comes from the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory spacecraft, which studies the sun. The GOF aspect monitors the sun and, according to the theory, has found some very interesting and perhaps very scary things about the sun, and what those are, we do not know, but it brings us the term golf rumors. Elizabeth Bathory is a name you are almost certainly familiar with. She was a Hungarian noblewoman from the powerful house of Bathory, who owned land in the Kingdom of Hungary. But what you will know the Countess for more is her brutal murder and torture of hundreds of girls between 1590 and 1610. She was put on trial along with 4 servants who helped in the murders, or, according to them, just buried the bodies. They were all ultimately convicted, and the 4 servants were executed, while Elizabeth Bathory was imprisoned in a castle where she would die under mysterious circumstances. Some say she was starved. She was so brutal, the legends were added later on to her deeds, such as she allegedly bathed in the blood of her victims, who were virgins, and Elizabeth apparently thought that this would help her retain her youth. While stories like that were added much later on, they were no doubt unreliable and probably just fictional, but we still know she was a serial killer, right? Well, that's the conspiracy, because many people believe it never happened, and Elizabeth Bathory was completely framed, with many historians claiming it was a witch hunt, which was in part made to destroy the family's influence in the region, which was considered a threat to the political interest of her neighbors. The accusations started to pop up between 1602 and 1604, which ultimately led to a prominent minister going to file complaints at the court for something to be done about her. But it would take a further 6 years before the accusations were taken seriously enough to investigate, which then led to her arrest. And it's important to point out here, the man that ordered the investigation was Matthias II, who was the king of Hungary at the time, and he just happened to owe the Bathory family a huge debt of money, and once she was arrested, it voided that debt. So I mean, it kinda makes sense. As well as the man that was appointed to investigate her, Georg Thurzo, also stood to gain a lot in his own political career by disgracing the Bathory family, and it's alleged he made up or exaggerated the evidence. Not to mention, the minister who filed the complaint was a Lutheran, while Bathory was a Calvinist, which may have caused some tension. However, there were more than 300 witnesses that provided damning testimony against her, as well as some of them were able to describe the physical evidence itself. Not to mention, the authorities found mutilated dead and dying imprisoned girls while they were arresting her, and Elizabeth had grew up in a home where she witnessed extremely brutal punishments of peasants by her father's officers, and that may have influenced her, as well as the fact that her own cruelty escalated after her husband's death in 1604, if you believe the allegations. In 2003, President George W. Bush would begin plans to invade Iraq, who, many at the time suggested, was harboring terrorists. The war was fraught with controversy right from the start. Whereas citizens mostly supported the Afghan war due to bin Laden, opinion was divided on Iraq, and maybe that's because there wasn't a clear picture on why the US was invading. Was it because Iraq was harboring terrorists like bin Laden? Was it a geopolitical move to rebalance power in the Middle East? Was it oil? Or was it Bush's grudge against Saddam for trying to kill his father? Or maybe, just maybe, it was weapons of mass destruction. Just maybe not the weapons you're thinking of. What if Saddam Hussein had came into possession of a Stargate? Yep, the device you see in science fiction movies that allows for near instantaneous travel between distant locations. That device possibly could be used at any time to invade the US, at a place inside the US, and you could never be prepared for it. Yes, that is the conspiracy known as Saddam Hussein's Stargate, the real reason Bush and his advisors were quickly pushing for a war. I couldn't find an exact starting point for this conspiracy, but it started making the rounds online by 2022, in which it alleged the Stargate portal was actually ancient alien in origin and was located in the Great Ziggurat of Ur, which is an ancient structure that used to be at the center of Mesopotamia, and the United States, along with Great Britain, got intel that the portal was being hidden there, so they had no choice but to invade and just use the pretext of weapons of mass destruction. Satoshi Nakamoto has long been a man at the center of conspiracy, and it's largely because, well, nobody knows who he is, other than being the anonymous founder of Bitcoin, and there's a ton of theories on who exactly may be using the alias Satoshi Nakamoto, but that's not what we're going to talk about here. We're going to look at another theory instead. What if Satoshi Nakamoto is not a man at all, and instead is AI? The reasoning behind this theory is that only AI could ever conceive of such a concept as cryptocurrency, and then, once it began, it could use the allure of money to encourage more and more people into buying in, which would then expand its own network and processing power, and it might also be the reason why Satoshi never revealed himself, because, well, he couldn't. He's not a person. And of course, this ties into more extreme theories, like Bitcoin is a part of the final beast system told about in the Bible, or that Bitcoin is actually a gift from advanced aliens. And although it's crazy, it is speculated at some point AI will be making purchases using cryptocurrency. But since cryptocurrency has been discussed since the early 80s, and since the early form of cryptocurrency came out in 1995 with eCash, it kinda kills this conspiracy. If you are watching this video, chances are you know a bit about conspiracies, which means you will probably also know about Operation Northwoods. But for the few of you that don't know, I'll recap. Operation Northwoods was a proposal by the CIA to stage and commit acts of terrorism against the US military and US civilian targets, and then blame it on the Cuban government, thus giving the US casus belli to declare war on Cuba. And let me be clear, this is not a conspiracy. That was a legit plan that was proposed and thankfully shot down. But it brings us to our next conspiracy of Pyrrhic Warfare, which basically alleges if the government is so prone to hiding information, then there's really no reasons to believe war is as ever simple as we're told, and instead could be fought over much greater causes that never get out to the public, and in what seems like an unjust war leading to atrocities, or a huge waste of resources over minor things, might actually be all we see on the surface level, and instead, wars are fought for much more crazier and much more dangerous reasons, which are kept hidden so the people don't panic, like preventing catastrophe-inducing weapons from being used, or a Stargate from being activated. It would kind of make a little sense as why the government might hide that and give us more simple, dumber reasons to go to war. The lottery is a form of gambling that some people play almost religiously, while others refuse to touch it, noting the tremendously small odds of winning, while a few will wait until the pot is extremely large when they will then buy one ticket just to take a chance. You see this a lot in Powerball, where very few will ever win any money at all, but what if the lottery was put there for another reason? That brings us to the conspiracy that the lottery exists to catch time travelers. The theory itself is pretty straightforward. Someone who has acquired the ability to time travel goes forward, gets the winning results of a lottery, goes back in time, and chooses those numbers, and bam, they're rich. This, according to proponents of the theory, has been discovered by the government, so the lottery has been used since to catch people who are exploiting it with time travel capability. And while this one is more like a meme conspiracy, there is the case of the recently deceased Joan Ginther, who won multi-million-dollar jackpots 4 times between 1993 and 2010 using only scratch-offs. The first one was $5.4 million, or about the equivalent of $11.4 million in today's money. Then she won $2 million in 2006, followed by $3 million in 2008, and finally $10 million in 2010, reaching a total of $20.4 million, which is the odds of 1 in 18 septillion, which Google says is a 1 followed by 24 zeros. The theory only gets credibility when you remember that the state governments often run the lotteries, which puts them in a perfect position to be on the watch for any time-traveling shenanigans. Of course, the deniers of this theory point out that it could just be luck, even if it is 1 in septillion, or it could possibly be a strategy, or even fraud. Thankfully, a few time travelers on TikTok have claimed they are not allowed to cheat the lottery because it would create a time paradox, so that's pretty comforting. May 16th, 1986, a film would be released that, although it garnered mixed reviews from film critics, it would go on to become a classic movie, as well as being the biggest earning film that year. Its budget was $15 million, and it ended up making $357 million, or, in today's money, about a $43 million budget and earning about $1 billion, so huge to say the least. The film, of course, was Top Gun, featuring Tom Cruise as U.S. Navy aviator Pete Maverick Mitchell, and without going too deep into the plot, Maverick would eventually make his way to the prestigious Top Gun fighter pilot school and would eventually be deployed and would shoot down enemy fighter jets. He then goes back to Top Gun and becomes an instructor himself, and the film would go on to be a fan favorite. The idea for it had actually came some 3 years earlier when an article in the magazine California detailed the daily life of fighter pilots at a naval air station in San Diego. This article was entitled Top Guns and influenced director Tony Scott, who had seen it, along with producers Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer. Now, according to the rumors around the film, they had a hard time getting a screenwriter and was in fact turned down by several until Jim Cash and Jack Epps Jr. accepted the offer, and they wrote the first draft. In doing so, they were invited to attend several declassified Top Gun classes and were even flown in a F-14. And this is where the conspiracy comes in, because the producers then asked the US Navy for assistance with the film, and they provided it. So much so that many think now the whole movie was nothing more than propaganda by the US Navy to boost recruiting. And this is one of these that, actually has a lot of facts in its favor, because the Navy, by all accounts, was very influential to the final script, and they had made a lot of changes. One of these was the opening dogfight, which was moved to international waters as opposed to Cuba in the original script. Likewise, they toned the language down to make it more palatable to a wider audience, because if it's one thing the military hates, it's foul language. But they also scrapped a scene of a crash on the deck of an aircraft carrier. In addition, Maverick's love interest was changed from a female enlisted member of the Navy to a civilian contractor because of the military's prohibition of fraternization between officers and personnel. But does this mean it was a propaganda film? It's difficult to say, but all of the signs are there. In fact, there was a huge uptick for enlistments to the Navy afterwards, and they credited the film for that. Followers of the unsolved and creepy disappearances have no doubt heard about the Tara Calico case. I even covered it at some point in the Mega series. Tara was 19 years old, living in Belen, New Mexico, when on the morning of September 20th, 1988, she took off on her daily bicycle ride along Route 47. What happened at this point is unknown, because Tara never returned home, and she's been missing for close to 40 years. It's thought she was most likely kidnapped. Now that's already a disturbing story, but it gets worse, because close to a year later, in 1989, way on the other side of the country, in Port St. Joe, Florida, customers at a convenience store parking lot would see something rather odd on a photograph left laying on the blacktop. The Polaroid had an unidentified young woman and boy gagged and bound. Why this was dropped in the first place is still unknown, but the photo was soon televised in an effort to try and locate these children, whom authorities hoped were just playing along in some kind of cruel, sick joke. After the photo went public though, family friends of the Calicos seen it and were convinced it was Tara, so they contacted her mother, who met with investigators and looked down at the photo and recognized the scar on her leg and identified her as her daughter, Tara. And to this day, she has still not been found, although investigators announced a breakthrough in 2023 that seemingly has led nowhere. But as mentioned, we've been over this case, and pretty much everyone knows about it. And our conspiracy isn't so much about Tara as it is missing people in general, and it brings about a question. Do you think it is more difficult to disappear now versus the 80s and 90s because of all the technology? That's where our conspiracy comes in, called attention dilution. The theory suggests that there is this common misconception that due to the fact we live in such an interconnected world now, it's way more difficult to disappear. But the truth is, because of that very reason, it's a lot easier to disappear. See, in Tara's day, since there was no social media, she would know way less people and be into contact on a weekly basis with even fewer than that. That day that she had disappeared, she had plans to meet her boyfriend, and of course, she had spoke to her mother that morning and possibly her siblings. And maybe she even had a job where she would run into a few more people later on. Or maybe she had plans with friends that evening. Now, take the typical 19-year-old young lady today, and with social media alone, she may come across hundreds of people in her periphery. And that's not uncommon. In this interconnected world, you have dozens of real-life friends you see every day, plus the friends online, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. And many of these people you will never meet, although they could be watching you from afar. But many of these will know you from friends of friends. But with that many people knowing your day-to-day activities, you can see where someone who wants to do harm might have a much easier time about doing it than the people in the 80s. The theory further elaborates that having such a wide circle of friends is counterproductive when it comes to reporting a missing person. Because if you open up social media and one person out of the hundreds of people in your feed has not posted, you're not going to think much of it. But in the 80s, if one of the few people in your social circle wasn't answering the phone all day, you're going to go check on them. I tried to do further research into this one, but the data from the 80s is hard to come by, and the data in the 90s is a little bit conflicting. But at least one source states 150,000 people were missing in 1980 versus 500,000 that were missing in 2022. Of course, America grew by over 100 million people in that same time frame though. Other data I could find shows that the worst year was in 1997, with a recorded 980,000 people that disappeared, and I do wonder how much that has to do with the internet being rolled out to people's homes. Regardless, it has went down ever since, except for 1 year when it spiked in 2022. So I'll wrap it up by asking what you guys think. Is it more difficult to vanish now versus the 80s and 90s, or do you think it's much easier now? The Mad Gasser of Mattoon was the name given to a weird criminal in the mid-1940s who apparently was responsible for a series of gas attacks in Mattoon, Illinois. Over 24 incidents were linked to him in a 2-week span, while he was cited numerous other times. The victims would often report they were sitting in their home when they would all of a sudden start smelling strange odors, followed by paralysis of their legs, coughing, nausea, and vomiting. Luckily, none of these were permanent, but it did set the area on edge. Police began their investigation and soon became skeptical. They believed it was nothing more than mass hysteria, and to this day, opinion is divided on the bizarre set of attacks, with some agreeing with the police that it was mass hysteria that developed from simple explanations like smelling nail polish or something like that, while others believe it was a legit set of weird attacks. But it brings about our conspiracy of innocuous false flags, which if true, would probably be what the Mad Gasser of Mattoon was. According to the theory, if the government or powers that be wanted to pull a false flag in the hopes of giving over more authority to the government, then some amount of fear must be stirred up in the population. However, if they go too far, the people will demand a massive investigation to be launched and the perpetrators to be arrested or worse, and in turn could possibly expose the whole thing as a false flag. That's where innocuous false flags come in. Some kind of terror-inducing crime that is minor, like invisible gas being sprayed into the homes of citizens that might make them a little sick, but not lethal, and they would make a full recovery within just a few minutes. Small false flags like this could possibly do more to citizens by making them feel unsafe while not causing widespread panic. And there are similar strange acts of terror like this that have taken place. 11 years prior to the Mad Gasser attack of Illinois, a similar set of attacks happened in Haymaker Town, Virginia, while the Pascagoula Phantom Barber would sneak into rooms of young girls and cut off locks of hair and leave. And in another weird one, the Phantom Whistler terrorized a family in Louisiana by hiding nearby their home at night and whistling before fleeing. In all of these cases, it caused widespread panic, in spite of the fact that no one was hurt. The law really didn't take any of them seriously either, which has suggested that they were hoaxes, or because they thought they could get an increased budget allocation because of the panic it had caused. And before we move on to the next topic, there is a semi-related theory that suggests that the Mad Gasser of Mattoon was really an alien. Spring 1992, in the American Midwest, real terror would begin, as an unknown serial killer that is still wanted to this day would begin his campaign of death. The I-70 killer would claim 69 victims, and possibly much more, between April 8th and May 7th, and possibly even in 2001. The murders took place in Indiana, Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, and his name derives from the fact that the stores where the murders took place were all just a few miles away from Interstate 70. His victims were almost always young, petite, brunette women, except for one, Michael McCown, a 40-year-old man working at his mother's store in Terre Haute, Indiana, and the killer would walk in behind him while he was stocking shelves and shot him in the head. No one's seen the killer. It's often erroneously reported that Michael was shot because he had a ponytail at the time, and the killer, seeing him from behind, mistook him for a woman. But that was not true, as Michael did not have long hair at that time, as his family has stated since. Besides, the I-40 killer was also suspected of another murder of a man named Billy Brossman at a Terre Haute liquor store, just blocks away from where Michael was killed. Although, it's unsure to this day if Brossman is actually linked to the I-70 murders. But that brings us to the question, what was the motive? Well, if we go by the canonical 6 murders, then it's pretty obvious that the profile he went for was young petite brunettes, and Michael was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. He just happened to be in his mom's store, which was named Sylvia's, and the killer went in, thinking with the female store name, that a female clerk had to be here, and probably got upset when he came in to see Michael, leading to him shooting him and fleeing. But what if the motive was a little more simple than that? That brings us to the conspiracy that the I-70 killer was suffering from highway hypnosis. This is another mystery that we have talked about in the past. Highway hypnosis is an altered mental state someone gets into when they are behind the wheel of an automobile for a long drive. Almost all of us have experienced it at some point. You've already driven over 100 miles or so and kinda just phase out. You still respond to the road and can drive safely to your destination. But once you get there, or once you come to, you have no memory of having driven it. And with the I-70 killer, it's believed he was regularly making these long drives over that month. Detectives don't believe he was a truck driver though, but instead might have been somebody driving a car for business or for visiting relatives. Regardless, he found himself in highway hypnosis, and that trance-like state, combined with his mental instability, led to his deep, dark desires taking over, and he began killing without even realizing it, as he embarked on a campaign of murder while completely unconscious of all of his actions, only to get back in the car afterwards with no memory of doing it and driving away. It's even possible, if detectives ever found him, he would pass a lie detector test with ease, since he really had no idea what he did, and lie detectors aren't that good anyways. Furthermore, he would not slip up in interviews because all he would remember was the long drive he took. This theory isn't strictly just the I-70 killer, but could apply to many other serial killers as well, especially the ones that were truck drivers who were constantly traveling for their work. The Max Headroom Incident is another famous mystery that almost every one of us have heard of, which happened in 1987 in Chicago, when a pair of TV broadcast stations were hacked and then displayed a man wearing a Max Headroom costume while a corrugated metal panel swayed behind him in the background. He then began to act bizarrely and basically spoke a lot of nonsense. The first interruption lasted about 17 seconds before WGN was able to regain control of the broadcast tower, but it would happen again 2 hours later on WTTW's broadcast of Doctor Who. This time, the signal takeover lasted much longer because nobody was on duty at the tower. In this appearance, the Max Headroom mask-wearing individual would make references to N.U.G.E.T, an animated TV series, and a WGN sportscaster, as well as other unrelated topics. He then began hitting a woman's bare butt with a fly swatter while he screamed, "They're coming to get me." She then began lightly spanking him while he pretended to cry and scream. After 90 seconds, his transmission was finally cut. That was 36 years ago, and the person that done this has never been identified, nor has it came forward, even though the statute of limitations have long been surpassed. But maybe they couldn't find him, and maybe he never came forward because he's not of this earth. That's what the Signals from Elsewhere conspiracy brings us. As you may well know, TV static is caused by a collection of random signals being caught by the satellite receiver when no specific station has been tuned in, at least on the old analog televisions like the ones during the Max Headroom incident. We also know that some of these random signals even come from deep space, so the theory postulates that if these signals can be detected from well beyond the reach of Earth, is it possible they could be picked up from dimensions beyond our own? Maybe even a parallel dimension. If that's true, the communication between dimensions might also be possible, which means the Max Headroom incident could have been an attempt by people from another dimension to try and communicate with us. Of course, that doesn't explain why they picked such a strange way to do it. It's also possible that, due to some kind of dimensional glitch, it allowed people on this Earth to view into that dimension. And maybe we were looking at some kind of comedy routine or some form of entertainment playing there. That would explain why the so-called signal hijacker was never identified. A man that has popped up a lot lately in the UFO community is that of Tom DeLonge, the guitarist and co-vocalist for the band Blink-182. He has made a lot of waves in his push for disclosure by the government in relation to UFOs and extraterrestrial life. In fact, the Pentagon would officially declassify 3 videos in April 2020 that showed unidentified flying objects that, due to Delonge's company, had already been leaked some 3 years earlier. So he's really into UFOs and disclosure. But what if Tom DeLonge is actually just working for the government as a way to do soft disclosure of UFOs? See, if a familiar face that some of us have seen comes out and starts talking about UFOs and aliens, it's a bit more comforting, and it allows the government to slowly start rolling out information without causing a panic. But it doesn't stop with Tom DeLonge. The theory actually brings up other celebrities who are also employed by the government to do this, such as Joe Rogan, who has a massive audience and is also pushed for disclosure. But the theory does expand into a variation of this conspiracy, and many suggest that Tom DeLonge and Joe Rogan and their ilk are actually working with the government to pull off a psyops, all in an attempt to see if people will really fall for the UFO story, possibly thinking if they can fool us with that, the public will be so scared of an extraterrestrial invasion that we will give up more freedoms in trade for their protection. So Rogan is working for the government to take away your freedoms. Bet you didn't see that one coming. When it comes to government conspiracies that were proven to be real, there are not many worse than Project MK Ultra, which was a human experimentation program designed by the CIA in which they studied different procedures and cocktails of drugs that they could use to weaken a person and force confessions through brainwashing or psychological torture. It began in 1953 and crazily ran for 20 years up until 1973. In this time frame, the CIA dabbled with numerous methods to mess with people's mental state and brain functions. Most famously, they used LSD a lot, as well as a lot of other chemicals. And the really insane part is, sometimes they done this without the subject's consent. They even took it a step further and used electroshock, sensory deprivation, verbal abuse, and worse forms of abuse. The CIA used front organizations to avoid having these tests connected to them, although at these institutions, many times the top officials were well aware of the CIA's involvement. This was made public in 1975 by a Senate committee, but by this point, the program had already been disbanded for 2 years, and many of the MK Ultra files had been ordered destroyed by the CIA director at the time, Richard Helm. So really, it's untelling what else they were into. A couple of years later, a FOIA request would uncover 20,000 more documents, which led again to more Senate hearings. Everyone is already probably familiar with that story. But our conspiracy, called Physicality Obsolescence, comes afterwards. Is it possible that MK Ultra is still running under a different name? Before we actually get into that part of the theory, it's important to point out MK Ultra had existed in some capacity before 1953, with another set of experiments called Project Artichoke, which ran from 1951 to 1953, and before that, it was originally called Project Bluebird. So with that knowledge, it's easy to see how it could have been swept under the carpet and kept going on to this day under a different name, although it might be a little bit difficult to, considering they had already went through 2 Senate investigations, which has led many to speculate that the program doesn't run any longer because they gathered all the knowledge they needed between the 1950s and early 1970s when the tests were concluded. Now, regardless if you believe there's an MK Ultra type project still running, or if the powers that be are just using the data they gathered in those experiments, the ending result is the same, which is the studies were such a success that we are all now being controlled by the government through such things like digital media, cell phones, numerous games, heavily processed foods. All of these things are on such a grand scale that no one would have even believed it possible 50 years ago. Heck, it's changed a massive amount since the 1990s. So is it possible that everything in our modern life that keeps us happy now was a long-term plan by the CIA? Was all this to keep us occupied and lethargic so a major police state will no longer be required at some point? That's the conspiracy. We have all heard that discussion before that the people in the past were way more advanced than we ever gave them credit for. And I think the vast majority of us actually agree with that sentiment. And in some ways, they were probably more intelligent than us. But just how advanced were they? Well, according to at least one theory, the internet was actually invented in ancient times. And then, like a lot of things, the technology was lost or destroyed and was only rediscovered in the past 40 years. But where does this actually come from? Well, a lot of it goes back to some of the earliest civilizations, especially the Egyptians and Sumerians, who were among the brightest peoples of their time. And sometimes, it's even thrown in that Atlantis played a hand in creating the internet. That is, if you believe it existed. The theory plays a lot off the pyramids, which was said to be an energy hub or transmitter on this wide area network, along with other ancient constructions, like Stonehenge. There was either an antenna or hub, while the Antikythera mechanism would have been a device that connected to the network. Sometimes, ley lines, those invisible lines of Earth's energy that are said to traverse the globe, yet are still viewed as pseudoscience, were said to be what connected all these sites, sorta like fiber optic cables. It's somewhat amazing that we spend 1/3 of our lives asleep, dead to the world in dreamland, yet most of the time, we don't pay attention to it or even remember our dreams. And we all know how super important sleep is. Without it, it can weaken your immune system, it messes with your digestive system, causing you to be overweight, messes with your heart health, and can cause memory and concentration issues. It will also make you cranky. But going without sleep for a long period, you will begin to hallucinate, seeing and hearing things that aren't there, as well as triggering mania episodes for people who have bipolar disorder, and causing anxiety, depression, paranoia, and suicidal thoughts. And it's these psychological effects that leads us to the first part of this conspiracy, which involves dreaming. What if dreaming is not just some passive act of your falling asleep? What if instead, it is a critical part of a person's self-maintenance, the maintenance mode that is needed to process emotions and maintain your mental health, which is why there is a strong link between sleep deprivation and mental health issues. It could also be why we sleep so long. Maybe it's not because our body needs the physical recuperation period. Instead, sleep takes up so much of our time because it keeps us from going insane. This might also explain why we go unconscious after a bad injury. Could it be a defense mechanism our minds use to protect us as a way to keep our mental stability during a traumatic injury? And while we're on the subject of sleep, let's take a look at lucid dreaming, another good conspiracy. People around the world since the dawn of time have been fascinated with this ability. Lucid dreaming, if you don't know, is a type of dream where you realize that you are dreaming and can try to control it. Some people just have them for random reasons, like say, stress and anxiety, or drugs, but it is also a trainable skill, and some people intentionally try to enter the lucid dream world. It's especially sought out by people who are just naturally creative and will be more likely to control those dreams. And there are some strange benefits to intentionally going into these dreams. People who practice lucid dreaming are often reported to improve at problem solving, as well as getting better at controlling their emotions. But there are more conspiratorial thoughts when it comes to lucid dreaming. Some people believe that lucid dreaming may even have the ability to influence the real world. In fact, in ancient Egypt, priests would practice what they called incubation, a ritual in which they would sleep in sacred spaces in order to have lucid dreams. They would then, according to some ancient accounts, use the dreams to influence world events, like using the dreams to speak to their gods and maybe stop a drought that was plaguing the country. And then there was also those more selfish priests who used these dreams to try to sway the pharaoh's decisions to where it would benefit them. Which brings us to the CIA's interest in lucid dreaming. Oh yeah, you know it happened. Along with MK Ultra, the CIA was very interested in lucid dreaming. It's even on their own website. So again, not a conspiracy. But people within the organization believed, or maybe hoped is the better word, that lucid dreaming could be used as a way to gain information or alter someone's psychological state, and even how to train spies on how to operate in a dream state, all for the purpose of gaining intelligence. It's kinda like similar studies they did with remote viewing, which allegedly is the ability to use the mind to get information about something happening at a great distance. How much of this had to do with the Cold War is hard to say, but the CIA did believe that the Soviet Union was conducting very similar experiences with lucid dreaming. So you can probably imagine the fear they may have had that the Soviets could use the ability to control dreams, all in a way to extract information from prisoners they may have taken, or just to influence minds in the West. Heck, they could even teach their own spies to retreat into the dream world to resist torture. Now in this one, I couldn't find out if they tested lucid dreaming on unsuspecting individuals like the experiments in MK Ultra, but I'm going to guess that would be a lot more difficult to pull off. But if one could control another's dream, then it would be possible to plant suggestions and control their behavior without leaving any clue behind. So you can see why it was deemed so important. When it comes to ruthless dictators, there have been more than enough to write several hundred books on, and probably still have some left over. And while there have been some incredibly cruel ones, maybe none were worse than Ivan the Terrible. Now maybe, unsurprisingly, Ivan didn't have the best upbringing. He was born on August 25th, 1530, and by the time he was 3, his father would get an abscess on his leg and die from blood poisoning. It was then Ivan was named the Grand Prince of Moscow, but of course, way too young to reign. So his mother would rule as a regent in his place until he was old enough to take over. But just 5 years later, after turning 8, his mom would also die. And it was more than likely not. She had been poisoned by someone else in the family, leaving Ivan with no one. Even his nurse he had grown attached to, packed up and went to a nunnery. It's in later years, in Ivan's writings, he would complain about being left alone as a child. According to him, even the boyars, who were the elite aristocracy surrounding the prince, didn't pay any attention to him, leaving Ivan and his brother to wander around the castle, often begging for food and clothing. One of these families were named the Shuski, and they would later feel Ivan's wrath for this treatment, as he would at the age of 13 order his first assassination, when he had a member of their family killed and then thrown to the dogs, and he would eventually wipe out basically their entire family. From here, it only gets worse. He became an alcoholic, religious fanatic that was prone to fits of rage. He even killed his own son and beat his pregnant wife who miscarried. And I could go on and on about his misdeeds, but let us just say, his bloodlust was never fulfilled, and his paranoia only got worse. But in 1584, on March 28th, he finally died, after ruling Russia for close to 4 decades. He had suffered a stroke, but that's where our conspiracy begins. What exactly made Ivan so terrible? Well, the most common reason people point to is his less than stellar upbringing, which left him with a lot of emotional instability. But in 1963, Soviet scientists exhumed his body to study more, and they found excessive levels of mercury, and use of mercury as a medicinal aid in those days was not that uncommon, and it's thought he may have been using it as a healing ointment for his aching joints, or possibly arthritis. And we know that the mercury is toxic and can drive someone insane. But even that is not the conspiracy. In the 1990s, a Dr. Rudolf Vanzave would begin trying to reconstruct Ivan's facial features based on his skull. In doing so, he would stumble across a small metallic plate. It was only about 1 centimeter in diameter and was said to resemble an electronic mechanism, sort of looking like an electronic chip found in computers. It's thought that, because a layer of bone tissues had grown around it, it must have been implanted into his head as a small child, and that while it did grant him great intellectual abilities, it also caused uncontrollable rages. The doctor also stated, after a closer examination, he believed this object in Ivan's skull was transmitting electrical impulses to Ivan's brain and heart, while another researcher working with the doctor took it a step further and stated that Ivan the Terrible had spent his life under the control of an alien who had put the chip in his brain, and that according to him, Ivan reported being visited by strange humanoid figures when alone in his room. Of course, It could have also been metal from a weapon or a helmet or something. When one mentions the deep web, it's hard not to get an unsettling feeling thinking about all of the disturbing content that could potentially be hidden there, and that's exactly what happened to the users of the paranormal board on 4chan known as X in 2013, when an anonymous poster claimed to have stumbled upon some really disturbing clips. According to the poster, who had the handle of Bones, said he found a video on the dark web entitled 5-Hour Video, which according to him showed undeniable proof of extraterrestrial life. Among the videos were really good, unmistakable UFO sightings, along with alien autopsies, and even the military special forces having encounters with these alien beings. The video was described as the most concrete evidence ever produced showing real alien life. Now the disturbing part comes from the most infamous clip on the entire video, and it's said to be these Chinese soldiers who had somehow came into contact in a hidden bunker with the so-called Grey Aliens, and it's here the Chinese soldiers would just wildly massacre these unarmed beings. The posters in the thread, who had allegedly seen it all, would speak to the horror of the film, which brings us to the next part. Who all actually seen it? The threads always seem to boil down to a few posters who claim to have actually witnessed it, while the vast majority had not seen it and could not find it, which then led to the next part of the conspiracy that the powers that be, maybe the CIA again, made the video disappear from the deep web, and bam, it was gone for good. Or was it? According to some posters in these threads, some quick-thinking anon was able to download the whole video, and contrary to its name of 5-hour video, it was actually around 3 hours. Regardless, he would always end up trying to upload it only to see it fail, and it was never seen on the deep web again. And the only thing we got from it was 4 screenshots said to be from the video, but I'll leave it to you. Was this a clever 4chan LARP again, or was there something to it this time? When you think of LA, you may think bright city lights, Hollywood, and the such. But one thing you may not realize is, LA is the home to the Los Angeles City oil field, just north of downtown. It's about 4 miles long and a 1/4 mile across. And the reason you may not know that is, LA does such a good job at hiding it. In fact, to keep the city up to its aesthetic code and to protect its image as a tourist destination, the oil rigs are not allowed to be publicly displayed. Instead, they are cleverly hidden in plain sight by buildings and towers, which leads to our conspiracy. If cities will go this length to create its idealized image, is it possible they would do more? Like building an entire city of facades. What if LA had also constructed buildings for no other reason than to give the appearance of a populated metropolis? Inside the structures are completely empty and have no real purpose, other than to give off the impression that it's busy. Which leads to a wider thought. If LA is doing this, what about other major cities? Could a metropolis like New York or Miami just be 90% empty, all to appeal to tourism? You can let me know what you think in the comments section below. This brings us to the conclusion of this conspiracy-themed installment of Insomnia TV. It's something I've been wanting to do for a while, and I hope you guys enjoyed. If you like it, let me know in the comment section below, and I can do another one in the future. Until then, goodbye and good night.